Michael Thornton stepped out of his sleek black Lexus and onto the paved driveway of his luxurious villa, not even bothering to glance back at the expensive vehicle. To him, it was just another material possession, one of many he had accumulated over his successful career. As the CEO of Thornton Enterprises, one of the largest investment firms in the city, Michael was used to living in the lap of luxury. The palatial home with its pristine landscaping, sweeping archways, and immaculate decor was merely the physical manifestation of his wealth and power. Slipping the keys into the pocket of his tailored Armani suit, Michael strode up the front steps with an air of confident nonchalance. His brilliant business mind and ruthless negotiation tactics had made him a multi-millionaire by the age of 40. Nothing could rattle his unshakable sense of self-importance. Just as he reached for the ornate front door handle, the jarring trill of the doorbell cut through the peaceful silence surrounding the estate. Michael paused, his expression hardening into one of disdain. He was not accustomed to unexpected visitors arriving unannounced at his sanctuary. Turning towards the large window beside the door, he peered out to see who dared disturb him. The sight of a shabby-looking woman standing on his polished marble step made his lips curl in distaste. Her faded, ill-fitting clothes and unkempt appearance were offensive to his cultivated sense of style and wealth. With an irritated sigh, Michael pulled open the door, regarding the woman with unconcealed judgment and impatience. "What is it? Make it quick, I don't have all day," he said dismissively. The woman seemed to shrink under his cold gaze, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Sir, please, I don't mean to intrude, but I'm in desperate need of help," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son is very ill, and I have no money for his medical treatments. I've been going around asking for any spare change or assistance that anyone can provide." She raised her watery eyes to meet Michael's steely gaze, fresh tears spilling down her hollow cheeks. "Please, sir, I'm begging you. Even just a few dollars could be life-saving for my little boy. He's all I have in this world." Michael stared back at her impassively, unmoved by her tragic plea. Dealing with this pathetic creature was merely an annoyance, an unwanted distraction from his comfortable life. Why should he spare a second thought, let alone his hard-earned wealth, for a stranger's problems? "I'm afraid I can't help you," Michael said, his voice hardening with finality. "I don't make a habit of opening my wallet for every hard luck story that comes knocking on my door. I'd suggest taking your begging elsewhere before I call the authorities to have you removed from my property." The word struck the woman like a physical blow, her shoulders slumping in defeat as she shrank back. Michael had already lost interest, however, and with a deft motion he pulled the door closed, sealing himself off from her muffled sobs on the other side. Straightening his lapels, he carried on into the house, pushing the unsettling encounter from his mind. He had far more important matters to concern himself with than the plights of the city's destitute. The next evening, Michael was reclining in his luxurious study, sipping a glass of his favorite 30-year-old Scotch whiskey. He had just finished reviewing the quarterly reports for Thornton Enterprises, extremely pleased with the firm's profits and growth projections. A self-satisfied smile played across his lips as he envisioned ways to reward himself for his financial success, perhaps a new yacht to add to his collection, or a luxurious trip to his private villa in the Swiss Alps. The possibilities were endless with his substantial wealth. His smug reverie was suddenly interrupted by the jarring sound of the doorbell echoing through the marble foyer outside. Michael's brow furrowed in annoyance. He was not expecting any visitors this evening, let alone unannounced ones. Surely his staff knew better than to allow solicitors onto the premises. Setting down his glass with an irritated huff, Michael rose from the plush leather chair and strode out to the foyer, ready to berate whatever poor soul had wandered uninvited into his domain. However, when he flung open the door, he was met by a heartbreakingly familiar figure. It was the same downtrodden woman from the previous night, somehow appearing even more wretched and desperate than before. Her thin frame was practically swallowed by the ragged clothes hanging off her bony frame, and her eyes were rimmed with dark circles from sleeplessness. "You again?" Michael sneered, instantly regretting opening the door at all. "I thought I made it clear last night that I want no part in your ridiculous sob story. How—" The woman flinched at his cruel tone but stood her ground, clutching something to her chest. Please, sir, I don't mean to pester you, but I have nowhere else to turn," she said, her voice cracking with suppressed emotion. "My son's condition has only worsened since last we spoke. The doctors say he needs an emergency surgery, but the costs are astronomically high. She held out what Michael could now see was a tattered photograph, the image of a pale, sickly young boy gazing hauntingly back at him. "This is my Jacob," the woman went on, her anguish palpable. "He's just a child, completely innocent. I cannot lose him. He's my whole world. I'm begging you, from the bottom of my heart and soul, please help me save my son's life. Anything you can spare would mean more than you know." Michael stared back at the woman, his expression utterly devoid of empathy or compassion. How foolish she was to think her pathetic display could sway his heart. His immense wealth was the result of looking out for himself and protecting his own self-interests. Naive charity was for the weak. "I'm afraid I have no more help or money to offer you than last night," he said coldly. "Your son's medical crisis is an unfortunate situation, but it's not my burden to bear. I suggest you take your begging elsewhere before I'm forced to take more extreme measures to remove you from my property." The word struck the woman like a physical blow, her eyes widening in disbelief and anguish as if he had plunged a knife into her heart. A heartbroken cry tore from her lips as she crumpled to the hard stone steps, sobs racking her frail body. Michael watched the display with a total lack of feeling or remorse. Turning on his heel, he strode back inside, slamming the door firmly shut on the woman's agonizing wails. Her problems were no longer his concern. He had far more important matters demanding his focus. 7 years later, the purr of a powerful engine cut through the still evening air as Michael guided his custom Ducati motorcycle along the winding country roads. He had spent the last few days touring the rural areas outside the city, taking advantage of the warm early summer weather and quiet open roads to indulge in one of his favorite pastimes. With his black leather jacket and designer sunglasses, Michael looked every bit the wealthy rogue, embracing the sense of freedom and power that came with controlling such a finely tuned machine. He smirked to himself, mentally adding up the costs of this little excursion. Several thousand for the bike rental and accessories. A few thousand more for the luxurious cabin he was returning from. Mere pocket change for a man of his immense wealth. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Michael realized he should start making his way back toward the city before full darkness fell. He gunned the accelerator, feeling a rush as the powerful engine surged forward. However, around the next sharp curve, Michael's mouth curved into a frustrated sneer as he spotted debris littering the road up ahead. Some careless person had apparently lost part of their load, spreading wooden planks, nails, and gravel across his path. "Damn inconsiderate fools," he muttered darkly, maneuvering the bike in a wide arc around the hazard. As he did, Michael felt a violent jolt and lurch as the back tire ran over something jagged on the road surface. He desperately fought for control as the motorcycle veered and wobbled beneath him. Realizing the tire had ruptured and was rapidly deflating, Michael could only brace himself before the bike violently laid over, metal scraping against asphalt as it slid unceremoniously to a halt in the empty country road. Cursing loudly, Michael dragged himself free from the wrecked bike, his heart pounding in his ears. His designer jacket and sunglasses were scuffed, and his left knee was bloody from being gouged on the road. More annoyed than seriously injured, Michael's eyes flashed with fury as he surveyed the damage. "This is going to cost me a damn fortune to repair or replace," he snarled, giving the crumpled bike frame a kick in frustration. Michael's anger only grew as he looked around, realizing the isolated area was completely deserted. It was starting to get dark, and his cell phone had shattered in the crash, leaving him with no way to call for a tow or ride. Miles of winding country backroads separated him from the nearest town in either direction. "Absolutely fucking perfect," he spat bitterly. He had no choice but to try hiking to find a mechanic, gas station, anything. Michael settled in for a long, tedious wait on the empty road as twilight gave way to the enveloping darkness of night. Several hours into his solitary vigil, Michael's head snapped up at the blissful sound of an approaching engine. A pair of headlights appeared around the bend, the first sign of life he had seen in what felt like an eternity. As the vehicle, a rusted, decade-old pickup truck, grew nearer, Michael rose and began frantically waving his arms to flag it down. "Hey, need some help over here!" he hollered hoarsely. The truck slowed before coming to a stop next to Michael and his crippled motorcycle. The driver door opened, and a young man stepped out, looking no older than his early 20s. His worn jeans, work boots, and scruffy jacket suggested someone accustomed to manual labor. What seems to be the problem here? The young man asked as he approached Michael's bike on the road. My tire is completely shot, cut to ribbons on some debris back there, Michael explained curtly, trying to mask his frustration and relief. I don't suppose you could give me a ride back to town? I'm prepared to compensate you for the trouble, of course. To Michael's surprise, the young man simply shook his head. Afraid I can't take you into town. It's a good 25 miles in the opposite direction I'm headed, but you're welcome to come back to my family's place for the night. We could figure out getting your bike towed and fixed in the morning. He shrugged. Not like there are any tow trucks or mechanics available out here this late anyway. Michael opened his mouth to argue, to insist on finding immediate roadside assistance, no matter the cost. But as he eyed the young man's offered ride, that run-down, beat-up old truck, a wave of resigned weariness washed over him. After hours stranded on these deserted country roads, any form of help was better than none. Very well, I accept your offer, Michael replied stiffly, hiding his reluctance behind a mask of his trademark arrogance. Lead the way. The pickup truck rumbled along the deserted backroads, kicking up clouds of dust in its wake. Michael sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his arms folded and jaw clenched as he stared out the windshield. He couldn't believe the incredible string of bad luck and indignities he had suffered. Here he was, a multimillionaire businessman reduced to being ferried around in this rust bucket of a vehicle by some blue-collar nobody. The entire situation was infuriatingly demeaning. Not much further now, the young man said, seemingly oblivious to Michael's seething silence. My family's farm is just up ahead. True to his word, a ramshackle homestead soon came into view. Michael felt his lip curl in distaste as they pulled up to the dilapidated house and scattered outbuildings. So, this was where his unfortunate rescuer resided. A poor, run-down excuse for a property that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the Great Depression. We don't have any guest rooms or nothing fancy, the young man said as they climbed out of the truck. But I can get you set up on the couch inside for tonight. Bathroom's through that door. Help yourself. Without waiting for a response, he headed off towards one of the outbuildings, leaving Michael to make his way to the house alone. Shaking his head in disdain, Michael ascended the creaky front porch steps, brushing past the rusting patio furniture and peeling door frames. The interior of the home was just as rundown and antiquated as the outside, with obsolete appliances, worn furniture, and a thick layer of dust over every surface. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line as he gingerly took a seat on the sagging sofa, afraid it might collapse beneath him. He couldn't remember the last time he had been in such poor, low-class living conditions. You must be our guest for the night. Michael turned at the sound of the feminine voice, his eyes widening slightly as a woman entered the living room. She looked to be in her 40s or 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a messy bun. Laugh lines creased her face beneath warm, hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners as she offered him a welcoming smile. Terry said he was bringing someone by after helping him with some car troubles. I'll get some sheets and blankets set up to make you more comfortable, she said, whisking off towards another room. As she moved about getting things prepared, Michael couldn't help studying her in bewilderment. There was something vaguely familiar about her that plucked at the corners of his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. When she returned with some worn linens to make up the couch, Michael cleared his throat. I do appreciate you putting me up for the night. This whole situation is rather unfortunate. The woman laughed lightly as she fluffed a flat pillow. Oh, I'm sure it's been a hassle getting stranded out here, but try not to worry. We'll get you sorted out. I'll have Terry give you a lift into town first thing to find a mechanic. Again, that nagging sensation of recognition flickered in Michael's mind as he watched her fuss over preparing the makeshift bed. Where had he seen this woman before? The curiosity gnawed at him until finally he spoke up once more. I don't mean to pry, but have we met before? You look extremely familiar to me. The woman paused, turning to study Michael more closely. Her brow furrowed as her eyes roamed his face, and then her own expression shifted in apparent recognition. Well, isn't this a small world? She murmured, a sad sort of smile playing across her lips. I can't say as I expected to ever see you again, Michael Thornton. Michael felt like he had been kicked in the gut as the pieces finally slammed into place. This woman, this painfully familiar face, it was the beggar woman who had shown up on his doorstep years ago, pleading for help for her deathly ill son. A son that had been turned away without a second thought. His mouth went dry as he looked upon her now, living in apparent poverty, yet treating him, a despicably wealthy stranger, with warmth and kindness. How could she not despise him after the cruelty he had shown her? Shame and regret swirled sickeningly in Michael's gut for the first time in longer than he could remember. For once in his life, the arrogant millionaire found himself utterly speechless. An awkward silence stretched between Michael and the woman, broken only by the muffled sounds of movement filtering in from elsewhere in the old house. Her eyes studied him pensively, as if trying to read the flurry of emotions battling across his features. Finally, she seemed to take pity on his uncharacteristic speechlessness and continued in a gentle tone. I figured you probably wouldn't recognize me right away after all these years. My name is Elizabeth Porter. She gave him a sad smile. But I've gone by Liz ever since my son Jacob was born. It was easier, simpler that way. The mention of her son's name made Michael flush hotly, the lingering shame and guilt over his selfish past actions striking him anew. This woman had been desperate to save her own child's life, and he had turned her away without a second thought. Your son, he managed hoarsely. He he was the one who was so ill that night. The night you came to my home begging for whatever help I could give. Liz nodded slowly. That's right. My beautiful little boy had been diagnosed with end-stage renal failure. Without emergency treatment and transplant surgery, the doctors gave him only a few weeks to live at most. Her eyes grew misty with the painful recollection, her voice lowering to a pained rasp. I was a homeless single mother at that point, out of work and resources. I had no choice but to go door to door, hat in hand, pleading with anyone who would listen for help to try and save my only child. Michael felt bile rise in his throat, remembering her anguished sobs as he slammed the door in her face, more concerned with the disruption to his evening than her heart-wrenching cries. How could he have been so callous, so blinded by his own fortune and privilege? You have to understand, Liz went on, her gaze boring into him with quiet intensity. A mother's greatest driving force is ensuring the health, safety, and survival of her children, no matter what. I thought for sure that when I came to you, a man of obvious wealth and means, you would see my desperation and show some basic human compassion to help. She shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But you turned me away, twice. You looked at me with nothing but disgust and contempt for being so destitute. At my lowest, most desperate point, you wouldn't even spare a few dollars to save an innocent child's life. The weight of Liz's words hung oppressively in the air. Michael could only stare back at her, utterly shaken to his core, to come face to face with the consequences of his own reprehensible selfishness and ego. He opened his mouth, but no words could find their way past the lump constricting his throat. A new sound of footsteps made them both look up as the young man, Terry, entered the living room, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. Hey, Ma, sorry it took me a bit to get everything locked up in the barn, he said, his eyes flicking between Michael and his mother with a hint of curiosity. You two know each other or something? Michael could only gape wordlessly as Liz turned her attention to her son, managing a watery smile. Yes, we're old acquaintances, I suppose you could say, she replied carefully. This is Michael Thornton, the man I told you about, from the darkest days before your surgery. Terry's brow furrowed in apparent recognition, and his eyes cut towards Michael with a newfound intensity, as if seeing him for the first time. So you're him, the young man said, his tone hardening slightly as comprehension dawned. The rich guy my ma begged for help when I was dying, but you turned her away like it was nothing. The accusation, spoken so matter-of-factly yet laced with quiet judgment, felt like a physical blow to Michael's gut. Shame and remorse burned through him, coursing through his veins like acid, until he could barely stand to meet either of their eyes. For so long he had insulated himself in his wealth, letting himself forget about the plights and struggles of those less fortunate. Now the consequences of his calloused indifference were laid bare before him in agonizing clarity. As Terry headed off to prepare his own bed for the night, Liz turned back to regard Michael with a look of sorrow and resignation. Why don't you try and get some rest? She suggested softly. I'll leave you alone with your thoughts. Rest did not come easily for Michael that night. He tossed and turned restlessly on the lumpy sofa, images and memories swirling relentlessly through his mind. He saw the haggard, desperate face of Liz Porter etched with despair as she begged for his help all those years ago. He heard the anguished sobs ripping from her throat as he callously turned her away without a second thought. More vividly than ever before, Michael could envision her beloved son, Jacob, just a young boy lying frail and sickly in a hospital bed, fighting for his very life. And through it all, Michael saw only his own contemptible actions, actions driven by greed, selfishness, and an arrogant disregard for the human suffering laid bare before him, all in the name of protecting his vast fortune and opulent lifestyle. As the night crept on in that tiny, ramshackle home, Michael finally understood the full, sickening weight of his shameful behavior all those years ago. He had potentially consigned an innocent child to die simply because showing any sort of compassion or charity was an inconvenient imposition. All his wealth, all his business achievements and success, in that moment it meant nothing. It could never undo or absolve the sheer cruelty and depravity he had shown a fellow human being at their most vulnerable. When the first rays of dawn began filtering through the curtains, Michael gave up the pretense of trying to sleep any longer. He rose stiffly from the sagging sofa, his eyes swollen and movements leaden from emotional and physical exhaustion. Padding quietly across the creaky floors, he made his way towards the kitchen in search of some water or coffee, something to settle his roiling thoughts. As he neared the kitchen entryway, hushed voices made Michael pause, hanging back in the shadows as he recognized Liz's voice. Tells the truth. I know you were trying to spare me from reliving those memories last night, but he deserves to understand fully what we went through, the hell I endured because of his callousness, Liz was saying, her tone heavy. I know, Ma. Believe me, I get it. That man is a prime example of everything wrong with the world. How those at the top have all the money and opportunities, but none of the compassion or empathy. Terry's voice replied bitterly. He left you with nowhere to turn, all because he couldn't be bothered to help. I barely survived, and it was no thanks to him. There was a tense pause before Liz spoke again in a strained murmur. I'll never forget those dark days, approaching total strangers, completely destitute, with Jacob's life hanging by a thread. I lost every shred of my dignity, letting my own pride completely shatter if it meant I could find a way to pay for his treatments. Her voice caught, thick with the weight of the painful memories. I sold everything I owned for whatever I could get. I panhandled and begged from dawn until midnight, getting turned away and berated over and over again by so many people like him. But I never gave up. I couldn't. Not when it was my child's life at stake. Michael felt his chest constrict in anguish, leaning heavily against the wall as he absorbed the devastating truth of the living nightmare Liz and Jacob had suffered through. Eventually, some generous souls were able to spare a few dollars here and there, Liz continued in a choked whisper. A kind clinic took pity on us and performed the surgery at a steeply reduced cost once I brought them what little money I had cobbled together. But Jacob still languished for over a year, so sick, in need of an organ donor and more money for anti-rejection drugs. I almost gave up so many times. But you never did, Ma. You never stopped fighting like hell for me, Terry interjected fiercely. I'm only alive today because of your strength and the kindness of strangers who could see past their own crap to save a dying kid. Michael's knees felt weak as the implication of Terry's words hit him full force. This young man, he was Jacob, the same gravely ill boy whose life had hung by a thread so many years before. A life that Michael himself had condemned by his selfish refusal to help in any way. As their hushed conversation continued in the kitchen, Michael slipped back away from the doorway, his mind reeling. He made his way back to the sofa in a stupor, sinking down and cradling his head in his hands as the weight of his overwhelming guilt and regret threatened to crush him. The rest of the morning passed by in a blur for Michael. He sat in a near catatonic state on the sofa, unable to fully process the torrent of emotions raging inside him. Shame, guilt, remorse. They swirled together into an overwhelming storm that left him feeling hollowed out and utterly unmoored. The simple truth, now laid bare before him, was that his actions years ago had almost robbed a young, innocent child of his life, all because Michael had been too arrogant, too blinded by his own wealth and privilege to show basic human compassion and empathy. What kind of person did that make him? He had always prided himself on his business savvy, his ability to remain coldly rational and calculated in his pursuit of success and riches. But now he could see just how twisted and corrupted that mindset had become. At his core, He was selfish to the bone, willing to turn a blind eye to even the most desperate of pleas if it meant being inconvenienced or dipping into his vast fortune. As the morning light slanted through the curtains, Terry eventually stuck his head into the living room, eyeing Michael with poorly masked disdain. Listen, man, I was able to get a tow truck lined up to come get your bike into the shop for repairs, he said gruffly. They'll be here in about an hour to load it up and haul it away. Michael nodded dumbly, not trusting himself to speak. He couldn't even bring himself to meet the young man's eyes. How could he, when he was now fully aware that Terry was the same boy, whose life he had so calloused, condemned to oblivion all those years ago, just by being unable to spare a few dollars or even an ounce of compassion from his unfathomable wealth? Terry watched him for a long moment before shaking his head in apparent disgust. You know, it's a damn shame, he muttered. Here I survived against all the odds, got a second chance at life, only for it to get rubbed in my face that heartless people like you are what make this world such a messed up place. The blunt words cut deep, each one a fresh lash of guilt across Michael's already flayed psyche. He could only nod stiffly, knowing he had no defense against the harsh judgment. For once, all his wealth and status meant nothing in the face of his moral failings. Terry retreated back toward the kitchen, leaving Michael alone with his turbulent thoughts once more. He knew he should feel relieved that the tow truck was on the way, that he would soon be able to extract himself from this surreal situation and return to the comfortable life his riches afforded him. But the perspective of fleeing back to his lavish home and material trappings felt utterly hollow and unfulfilling. In fact, Michael felt a rush of nausea at the mere idea of slipping back into the selfish, callous existence that had brought him to this point of utter emotional devastation. How could he go back to being that person? That man utterly devoid of empathy or concern for anyone except himself. After witnessing firsthand the nearly ruinous consequences of such unchecked greed and ego, the answer was simple. He couldn't. Not anymore. Not after realizing just how despicable and morally bankrupt his past mindset and behavior had been. Not when he knew now how easily he could have crushed an innocent life without a second thought. As the heavy footsteps of the tow truck's arrival sounded in the gravel driveway, Michael took a deep, shuddering breath, feeling something deep within his soul finally shifting in a profound way. He didn't know what his path forward would look like, but he knew without a doubt that things could not remain the same. Michael emerged from the dilapidated house just as the tow truck driver was securing his damaged Ducati onto the flatbed. He squinted against the bright morning sunlight, feeling emotionally and physically drained after the endless, agonizing night. As he began to make his way over to the truck, a voice called out from the house's front porch. Michael, a moment before you go, if you don't mind. He turned to see Liz standing there, a plate of food in her hands. Though her expression was composed, Michael could see the shadows of weariness and residual grief lingering in the creases around her eyes and mouth. His chest tightened guiltily at the sight. He knew he was the one who had helped chisel those harrowing lines onto her prematurely aged face all those years ago. Steeling himself, Michael climbed the porch steps until they were face to face once more. Up close, he could better make out the faint freckles dusting Liz's cheeks, the kind smile lines crinkling at the corners of her eyes, despite everything. It was clear that despite the hardships she had endured, an inner warmth and gentle spirit still burned brightly from within. I wanted to make sure you had something to eat before you left, Liz said, holding out the plate she carried. Just some eggs, bacon, and potatoes. A decent breakfast to start your day, at least. Michael was taken aback by the simple act of kindness and hospitality, his mouth going dry. You shouldn't have, he managed roughly, unable to meet her eyes. Don't be silly, it's no trouble, Liz insisted, pressing the plate into his hands. When he finally forced himself to look at her again, her expression had softened with something like empathy and understanding. Listen, I know last night must have been incredibly difficult and overwhelming for you after... She paused, picking her words carefully. After coming face to face with the consequences of what happened between us years ago. Believe me, I understand more than you could ever know. Her eyes grew distant for a moment, as if momentarily lost in the anguished memories of those dark days when she had been willing to beg and sacrifice anything to save her son's life. When Michael himself had turned his back on their shared humanity. Clearing her throat, Liz seemed to shake herself from her reverie, offering Michael a tentative smile. What I wanted to say is, I can see that confronting all of this has shaken you to your core. And while I can't pretend to understand your mindset or life circumstances fully, I do know that no person is ever too far gone to find redemption, to become a better version of themselves. Her gaze was warm, yet intense, almost imploring as she studied his conflicted features. Maybe this was the harsh wake-up call you needed to recognize that there's more to life than just the pursuit of wealth and success at all costs. That sometimes we all need to take a step back and remember our basic human obligations to one another: empathy, compassion, sacrifice for the greater good. Michael could only stare back at her, utterly disarmed and humbled by this woman's endless capacity for grace, even after the horrendous way he had treated her in her darkest hour. How could she stand here, offering a lifeline toward moral redemption to the same wretched man who had abandoned her to suffer alone? As if sensing his doubts and turmoil, Liz reached out and placed a gentle but firm hand on his arm, locking eyes with him intently. I'm not going to lie. For years after our paths first crossed, I hated you, Michael. But holding on to that anger and resentment was like drinking poison. It was only going to turn me cruel and bitter in the end. At some point, I realized the only way to find peace and move forward was through forgiveness, even for those who wronged me the deepest. Her fingers tightened almost imploringly around his arm. So if you take nothing else away from your time here, take this. It's never too late to change, to open your eyes to the world around you and start being part of the solution instead of the problem. Something inside Michael seemed to finally break apart in that moment, a hairline fracture splintering through the icy, calloused walls he had built around his heart over the decades. All of his arrogance, his condescending self-importance, the belief that his wealth made him impervious and untouchable, it all came crashing down in a million pieces around him. He was, at long last, forced to behold himself for what he truly was, a man not of substance or character, but of egotism and indefensible cruelty, a man who had willingly turned his back on human decency. But beyond that, he saw the glimmer of a future path where he did not have to remain morally adrift, unforgivable. Drawing a shuddering breath, Michael managed an imperceptible nod to Liz. He didn't have the words to convey the profundity of the paradigm shift she had catalyzed in his soul. All he could do was hope his eyes conveyed the depths of his remorse and his fledgling determination to do better, be better. As the tow truck rumbled to life, Michael turned and began his trudging descent down the porch steps, clutching the plate of food Liz had given like a lifeline. When he reached the sidewalk, he paused and risked a final glance back up at her quietly observing form. Their eyes met and held, a world of unspoken grief and forgiveness passing between them. And in that moment, Michael felt the heaviest burden lift from his shoulders, the realization that his story did not have to end with this shameful nadir, that this too could be a starting point from which to begin anew. The drive back into the city passed by in a blur for Michael. He sat mutely in the passenger seat of the tow truck, watching the scenery blur past with unseeing eyes. His mind was a roiling vortex of thoughts, memories, and the seismic internal shift he had just undergone. Liz Porter's impassioned words echoed through his head like a mantra, battering against the foundations of his previously unshakable belief systems. The way she had looked at him with a strange fusion of sadness, disappointment, yet persistent compassion, and belief in his ability to change, it was as though she had peered directly into the shadowed depths of his soul. And what she found there had shaken Michael to his core in a way he could have never anticipated. He had always prided himself on being a self-made man, clawing his way up from humble beginnings through shrewd business acumen and sheer force of will. He believed his vast personal wealth was both a reward for and tangible proof of his superiority over the masses, material trappings to fund his every desire, while separating him from the plights of the less fortunate. But in being so singularly consumed by his pursuit of riches and power, Michael realized he had lost a fundamental part of his own humanity along the way. Liz's harrowing story had torn away the veil of his arrogance and self-importance, forcing him to stare unflinchingly into the abyss of greed, ego, and moral apathy that he had allowed to consume him. What he saw in those endless depths shook him to his core and shattered his previously unshakable self-image. As the truck continued bearing him back towards the city and his luxurious estate, Michael found himself repulsed rather than soothed by the thought of retreating into that opulent, insular world of privilege once more. How could he return to hoarding his wealth, burying himself in profit margins and asset portfolios as though they were all that mattered in the world? After having his conscience torn asunder and the human cost of his selfishness laid bare in such a brutal manner? The answer was simple. He could not. Not anymore. Too many times throughout his life, Michael had steadfastly refused to hear or outright ignored the cries of those less fortunate when they dared intrude upon his comfort and indulgences. From hardened experience, he had allowed himself to become jaded and inured to human suffering, so long as it existed outside his narrow sphere of wealth and status. But the events of the past day had rendered that former way of existing null and utterly reprehensible in his eyes. Too much had transpired, too much had been brought into harsh moral focus, that he could no longer allow himself the cowardice of willful ignorance. As the truck finally rolled to a stop outside the gated entrance to his sprawling estate, Michael inhaled deeply and turned his gaze outward, soaking in the opulent splendor arrayed before him. The manicured lawns and gardens, meticulously curated by a veritable fleet of landscapers and groundskeepers, the towering, ornate fountains and modern statuary decorating the central courtyard, all commissioned from world-renowned artists at exorbitant fees. The palatial facade of his multi-million-dollar villa itself, all sleek lines and polished marble procured from the finest materials on earth. At one point, these luxurious trappings had brought Michael a deep sense of pride and accomplishment. They were the physical embodiment of his power, his wealth, the spoils of his tenacity and success in the business world. Surrounding himself with the lavish excesses had allowed him to become utterly divorced from the harsh realities of poverty and struggle faced by the masses every day. Yet now, as he gazed upon his opulent domain with fresh, disillusioned eyes, Michael felt only hollowness and shame. These obscene material riches were the outward manifestation of everything he had sacrificed his own humanity and empathy to attain. And despite gorging himself on the most rarefied luxuries that money could buy, he had still found himself weighed down by a soul sickness, an emptiness wrought from moral bankruptcy and bitter loneliness. The realization struck Michael with the force of a physical blow. In his decades-long pursuit of wealth and influence, he had allowed his own ethics, his compassion, his basic human decency to become utterly corroded away until there was nothing left but a contemptible, selfish wretch devoid of even the most fundamental capacity for kindness. But he did not have to remain that person. He would not allow himself to remain that person any longer. With a renewed sense of purpose and conviction blazing in his heart, Michael exited the tow truck and marched towards the gates of the estate, the broken wreckage of his motorcycle lying behind him. Another vestige of his former life now symbolically cast aside. No longer would he be beholden to the damning siren calls of greed, apathy, or self-centeredness. From this moment on, Michael vowed to dedicate himself to a life of selflessness and service to his fellow human beings rather than his bank accounts. Gone were the blinders of privilege and ego that had allowed him to turn a cold shoulder to those in need. Instead, his eyes had been wrenched open to the full breadth of suffering and inequity gripping so much of the world beyond his gilded private sanctuary, and he held himself personally accountable to combat that moral blight in any way he could. As Michael pushed through the gates and strode through the ornate grounds that had once been his sole source of fulfillment, he felt a profound sense of lightness and purpose unlike anything he could ever recall. For the first time in decades, he was no longer just existing. He was truly alive, with a newfound consciousness and drive to enact positive change in the world around him. The road towards moral redemption that Liz had cautioned would be arduous and fraught was one he now embarked upon clear-eyed, with sober determination. Self-reflection, philanthropy, championing those without a voice or means to speak out, these would become the cornerstones of his renewed values and self-worth moving forward. No longer would Michael Thornton allow himself to remain a passive observer and benefactor of society's ills through his greed and wanton self-interest. Now he would strive each day to become an active force for compassion and justice for all until his last breath. The path ahead was finally illuminated, the darkness of his past transgressions acknowledged and left behind. It was a new beginning, both for Michael himself and hopefully the spark of change that might one day help heal a fractured, imbalanced world in desperate need of more empathy and human decency.